Hi, I'm Ashley J. Hicks, or Ash. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a programs coordinator with A.R.T New York. A visual description of me: I am a pale Black woman with albinism. I have curly blonde hair. I am sitting in front of a blue background, and I am wearing a baby pink jacket. Before getting started, I am going to give a land acknowledgement. I would like to take the time to acknowledge that wherever we're currently located on Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, we are on occupied territory. A.R.T New York's membership in the 5 boroughs of New York City operates on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape, Wappinger, Canarsie, Rockaway, and Matinacock communities. I want to honor and celebrate all of these Indigenous communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. I also want to take this time to acknowledge that after there was stolen land, there were stolen people. I want to honor the generations of displaced and enslaved people that built and continue to build the country that we occupy today. Since we are gathered today in virtual space, let's also take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous people worldwide. I invite you to join me in acknowledging all of this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good use of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, anti-racism, and allyship. Thank you. The virtual part of that land acknowledgement was written by Adrian Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario, Canada. We're going to drop some links into the chat if you want to learn about whose land you're on, and also to call attention to further actions that we all can take beyond just giving a land acknowledgement. We'll drop a link in the chat as well. Okay, so without further ado, I will pass it on to your moderator for this afternoon, Risa Shoup.
Ash, thank you so much, both for that wonderful introduction to today's panel and all of the great work that I know you and other members of our staff did to put this event together today. I am so happy to be here. It's a wonderful break from the day-to-day of being an interim ED. I really am excited to be with our members and to talk about this subject, which I think we've all either discussed or implemented changes to our budgets over the last 2 years, and I'm looking forward to a robust conversation today, and appreciate in particular our panelists for giving us the time and sharing their stories with us. So my name is Risa Shoup. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I am the interim executive director of the Alliance of Resident Theaters New York. I am a white, non-binary person with short, dark hair, wearing a white button-down shirt with blue pin dots and a blue blazer over that. And I have thick square-framed glasses on. And I am lit from above indoors, but my Zoom background is intentionally blurred. I'm going to pass it to Maria to introduce next.
Hi, I'm Maria Striar. I use she, her pronouns. I am the producing artistic director of Club Thumb, which I'm one of the founders. And I am wearing a dark blue V-neck shirt. I'm a middle-aged white lady with a lot of inconsistently dyed curly hair right around shoulder length. And I'm on a background of sort of varied bedroomness, a bit of a picture, a bit of a chair, a bit of a mirror, a bit of a lamp and a window. And I will pass it along to Kate.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, I'm Kate Loewald. I'm the founding producer of Playco. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a white woman. I have long, dark brown and gray hair that's kind of a mess today. I wear clear gray framed glasses, and I'm wearing a Downtown United Soccer Club jacket today that's navy blue and white stripes. And I'm in my office with a white wall background with a few pictures on it. And I will pass it to Rob.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Bradshaw. I am the managing director at Playco. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a white male with short brown hair, and I am wearing a white and green striped button-down shirt with a black zip-up hoodie sweatshirt over top of that because it's still too cold for April. And I am also in my office, which has a lot of clutter, inbox things that I've been avoiding for several days, and my plant behind me, which is my little natural element in the space. And I will pass it to Hannah.
Hi, my name is Hannah Johnson-Walsh, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the executive director of Emit Theater. I'm a white woman with chin-length pinkish purplish hair, and today I'm wearing a black shirt and round dark blue glasses, and I'm sitting in my home office in front of a white wall, and you can see the door and a couple of framed images.
Wonderful. And I think we have all introduced ourselves. So just a quick breakdown of what you can expect from the rest of the afternoon before we dive into conversation. So in advance, Art New York staff and I, with a bit of feedback from our wonderful panelists, put together some guiding questions that I'll be asking, and I'm sure we'll go into some questions that just arise out of our dialogue as well. And we'll do this for about an hour, and then we've intentionally left some time in the schedule, about 20 minutes at the end, for you wonderful participants in the audience to ask questions. And just to reiterate what Ash said in the beginning, you can ask questions at the end in two different ways. You can type them into the chat, and Ash and Nikki will help make sure that I see them and that they get reflected and answered. Or you can simply come on mic and on video and ask them that way. Just know that if you do come on video, you will be in the video recording that we're doing of this. I hope that's clear. So if your camera is on, you will be seen in the recording. That's a note. All right. Without further ado, I'm going to ask our first question. And I'm asking this to all of you panelists, and I'll help us sort of go in a popcorn. So I will arbitrarily designate someone to begin, but this is a question that I would love to hear from all of you about. And it is, how has your budgeting model shifted? And can you tell us about the impetus for making that change or those changes? And I'll invite Hannah to begin.
Sure. So Emit Theater formed about 5 years ago with a very specific performance format. We were doing immersive adaptations of Shakespeare for young audiences. And those shows require a cast of 10 or 11, about 60 hours of rehearsal. And at the very beginning, we were quite scrappy. And our model for paying our artists was in the form of stipends. And it was just as much as we could afford to do show to show. And then over the last couple of years, we've developed new performance formats that are more flexible in cast size. They require less rehearsal time, but all while still adhering to our original mission and our brand of artistry of being highly accessible, highly interactive, having no fourth wall between the audience and the artists. And our performances scale from our full immersive performances to a workshop performance hybrid called sensory storytelling that can be facilitated by a single artist. And once we had developed more flexible performance programming, we were able to shift our thinking from what do we want our season to look like, and then what can we afford to pay our artists to make that happen, to, well, this is how much we need to pay our artists, and what kind of season can we afford to do? How can we pick from this menu of performance structures that we have to be within our budget? And part of the impetus for that was that our budget had grown enough that we were paying our artists large enough stipends that we couldn't really justify classifying them as volunteers anymore. And because in New York State, actors have to be employees, they can't be independent contractors, we made the move to put everyone on payroll, which was a really exciting milestone for us. And part of it was also that we had developed enough productions at that point that we realized we could sustain a few seasons, especially like during the pandemic, with a combination of remounts and with our smaller scale productions. And it was okay to go a couple of years without producing a full immersive piece, especially with the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm excited to talk more about this, but I want to make sure we intro with everyone. So maybe next, I'm just going in reverse order from our intros. Rob and Kate, how would you like to answer this question of how your budgeting model has shifted and the impetus for that change?
I'll start. We are a small producing theater that we produce and develop new plays from all over the world, including the US. And we currently, and have been for years, producing on the New York City LOA, which references the Off-Broadway agreement via Actors Equity. And I would say from about 2014 or 15, there was a formal plan put into place to incrementally increase artist compensation across the board. And that kind of shifted and molded through various internal and external considerations. An example of that is in 2016, all of the minimum wage laws and the overtime exempt laws started to change here in New York City. And so we had to adjust how we were setting those wages, because some were mandatory to be in line with the legal standards. And then during the pandemic, with all of the social uprisings that were happening and the publishing of the We See You document, Kate and I spent, I mean, dozens of hours, like twice a week, had time on the calendar where we just went through that document and identified the places where we felt that Playco was falling into practices or practices that were harmful to all or certain communities, and how can we make those changes? And during the pandemic, it was an opportunity to do what we've called an organizational reset, and just really rethink how we compensate people, how we work, how we schedule, how we plan, and really took the time to think about that, how that would happen. And so one of the very clear things was that the incremental changes were no longer appropriate. And so we did make a pretty big jump, anywhere between 20 and 100% jump in fees for artists across the board. And that's a pretty big range. And that's because some tracks did increase a lot over the past few years because of legal standards and whatnot, whereas other tracks fell behind because we were trying to keep up with the times. And so we kind of did a internal calculus of like, how do we bring everyone up to the same place? And that's all I'll say for now. And Kate, I'm sure you might want to add context. Or I probably forgot to say something that's important.
No, I mean, I would just add to that I think fundamentally the shift in our budgeting model is similar to what Hannah was saying, that to oversimplify, in the past, our budget was built around the programming that we wanted to do and like, how are we fulfilling our mission with programming? And in this process that Rob just described, we shifted that to say, how are we going to take care of the people that work with Playco? And so making the kinds of adjustments and compensation and other areas we can talk about later that Rob described, we realized, at least in the short term, as we're coming back from the pandemic, might have implications on how much programming we can do or how we do our programming. And we had to sort of take a deep gulp and say to each other, you know, this is the priority. Paying people and these other adjustments that we have made is the priority. And if that means we have to do less work for a while, or do work differently, then that's, we'll live with that. But this is the priority. So that's, I would say, the fundamental shift.
And thank you both. And I'm just going to say, if it looks like I'm looking away and typing, it's because I am, and I'm making notes for follow-up. And I'm going to flag for all of you that we're definitely going to come back to something that Kate just said around how, you know, if in the past their budget was focused on programming and fulfilling the mission, I have some questions about how the inverse of that has shifted here in the present. So note for everybody. All right, Maria, round us out.
Okay, so Club Thumb's mission is that to commission, develop, and produce funny, strange, provocative new plays by living American writers. And that's what we do. We are a small team, and we've been around for a long time. And I would say that there's enough, if different, common territory with the people who've spoken previously, that instead I'll maybe just add some nuggets instead of doing an overview. I think that one of Club Thumb's great strengths as a really small and not particularly wealthy organization has always been to leverage resources flexibly. And I think that as those resources have, but as a few more of those resources have become monetary, it's sort of like it's in some ways a double-edged sword, because you lose some flexibility the more money you have, even if it's not that much more money. So I want to sort of just kind of introduce the concept of flexibility and flexible budgeting, which has been such a crucial element of the last few years. And some of that's contingency budgeting, you know, of sort of making sure that you have the ability to maneuver around new and exciting challenges, like, you know, pandemics, and labor costs rising and supply chain issues and blah, blah, blah. But the more sort of positive version of that certainly emerged during the pandemic was the most expensive thing you can do is produce full shows. So when you can't do that, you suddenly have a lot of like resources floating around, and figuring out sort of a bucket system, sort of places to like kind of go like, these are some things I'd like to do with this money. I don't know what they are, but these are some, you know, I want to make sure that this money gets paid to artists somehow. I want to, and this, you know, I guess understanding that we are in a time of where it's especially difficult to predict what's going to be going on in the, you know, the coming weeks has really changed for now, and in some ways permanently, the way that we approach budgeting, which has been always based on like what I know, what I review, what I found out was lacking, what I wanted to do more of, and is now more a little like, who knows? The other thing I would like to introduce as a general sort of area that's sort of related, I guess, is we had the great fortune over the course of a couple of years leading up to the lockdown of running a few pretty decent surpluses, which came out of doing things we'd never done before and having no idea if they'd be financially successful, and then having, you know, a nice little pot of cash that was unexpected and unbudgeted for. And we socked those away, and that provided not only you know, a great sort of to have a cash reserve during a pandemic is a big relief, but it's also created an ability for us to plan and budget, knowing that we have a bit of a safety net and that we don't have to be quite as sort of rigid. I mean, I'm speaking in terms of being a small company and not having a lot of like extra fat around, and how like tightly you sometimes have to budget, and sort of because nobody's going to pay that bill but you. So I guess I want to advocate also for the idea of saving, and how you can sort of try and accrue a surplus. And I realized I didn't really cover the whole thing. I just want to introduce a few ideas, because so much of what the others have said are also obviously comparable ingredients. And I apologize for my dog in the background.
No, I appreciate those concepts, and I think we're going to go back to a number of them. And we appreciate the dog's input as well. Although I'm not quite sure what they were getting at there. So before I move on to like the next question that we had designed, and our panelists folks have all seen these questions in advance, I do want to go back to something that Kate was talking about. So, you know, Kate, you mentioned that in the past, the budget was focused on executing the programming and fulfilling your mission, and now the focus is on the people. And I'm curious to know how this change in focus to the people has impacted your mission and your programming. And you pointed to this a little bit, but yeah, I want to know how a new approach to the budget impacts the programming, and in what ways. And maybe Kate, since I picked up on something you said, if you could start, but again, then I'll just ask anyone to come on mic and speak.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question. And I would say that this shift certainly makes us feel we are more fully fulfilling our mission. We have to take care of the people first. And, you know, I think we're all familiar with the We See You document, and probably also with the sections in there that talk about the show must go on mentality. And so this is related to that. And just forefronts the people who are doing the work that fulfills the mission. And it's very early days yet to talk very in a detailed way about how it has affected our programming, because we are just coming back to production, for example. But I don't feel it is, it has to do with the volume of programming, and also with we think about how we make the work happen. So we anticipate that we are going to be partnering a lot more to make work happen. We're considering what union contracts we engage with so that we can, we may shift our equity contract, for example, because, sorry, there's a fly bothering me at the moment. I'm not just like making strange gestures because we want to have the best work situation for our equity members. I think the short answer is, in these early days of this new model, it's going to be about finding more partnerships. It's going to be, I think Maria's word of flexibility is a watchword for us as well, and going to be really important in terms of the time frame. And I won't get into this right now because I don't want to take so much time, but for us specifically, because we work with a lot of artists from abroad, it also has implications for the kinds of residencies that we can provide, or whether we're now going to be working with people from other parts of the world virtually more than we used to. We've had a big learning curve with that during the pandemic. So I think it's more about how we accomplish the work than having to cut back on the work, at least so far. And Rob, I'm sure you have things to say about that as well.
I think I would just add, as we think about like how, as Kay was talking, I was like, how has it impacted our mission? I think, as we've gone through this work and this process, we've also involved the staff and the artists in various ways in these conversations. And I think, one of the things we learned is that artists in general are excited to work with Playco and how we approach the process. So I feel like these changes have just enhanced the experience for the artists that are coming. And I think Kate said it is early in this process and early days for us. So I don't think we can say definitively like what the impacts have been. And then, yeah, I think it does, a few years ago, we made a conscious decision as an itinerant theater without our own space to move away from things like co-productions, especially co-productions with companies that do have their own space, because it can be challenging for the company coming in and sharing a space with another company to get recognition. And that's not a judgment of our co-producers, it's just kind of the landscape of New York theater and how people psychologically associate theater with structures, but that said, I think in order to do this, co-productions are things that we have to reintroduce into the approach, because we're putting a lot more resources towards people and how we're treating people. And so we have to, over time, figure out a way to build up our capacity to be fully sustainable. And in the interim, it does mean being flexible, sharing resources with other companies and whatnot. So I think it's had a positive impact and also a challenging impact. So it depends on which way you're looking at it.
And before we move on, does anyone have anything that they want to add, about this, the way that these budgetary changes have shifted the way you do your programming? Are there aspects of your work?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So by prioritizing compensating our artists as best we can, and then coming up with these different performance formats, we were able to do more performances throughout our season. So before, when we were doing like 1 or 2 like big shows per year. And we also now have a partnership with the Shakespeare Forum, who's in residence at El Barrio's Art Space in East Harlem. And we were doing our performances there. And we were thinking, well, since this is where our performances are, and El Barrio's Art Space is it's a live workspace for artists and their families. We wanted to be able to be more of a presence in that community and show up more than just a couple times a year. And so because we had started developing these more like nimbly producible pieces, we were able to kind of become synthesized with the community at El Barrio's Art Space more. So right before the pandemic started, we had just started a monthly pop-up performance series. I think we got 2 installments in before COVID hit. But then we started doing a different format outdoors. We do the sensory storytelling workshops that I mentioned earlier, as well as another highly improvised form of performance that we're doing like on a somewhat monthly basis. And it's allowed us to really deepen our connection to that community. We know a lot of the families that live there now. They're excited to see us. We're collaborating more with the families that live there in terms of developing new types of programming. We're looking to do like an after school session there. And so by giving ourselves like the freedom to try more formats, we've gotten like a much deeper connection with our audience and the communities that we serve.
I will add something that is not really a sort of direct response, but it's kind of, I don't know, it's another little nugget. One of the things, because of having had to work virtually for such a long stretch, it afforded a lot of pain and a few insights, which, some good developments here and there. And one thing that we did on this one, we did one really big production, and the director of that production is somebody who works with their own theater company and like a collective, and thereby is somewhat used to tracking her time. And because we were doing this big virtual production, it's like we had no idea what the model was for paying people. We had, some things that were like SAG contracts, but we were a little all over the map in terms of like how to budget it. So we basically kind of proposed like, look, how about let's start with this, and you guys should track your hours because it's more trackable when when it's all mediated, like when you're on and when you're off, and we'll adjust as needs be. And we did this, because there were also way more designers, there were editors, there were, it was just a completely unfamiliar shape of things, and that was in some cases we were right on. In some cases we probably overpaid in terms of what we were proposing as an hourly wage, and everybody was fine with that. We were too. We weren't going to take anything back. And in some cases people were like, well, actually I worked this hours. And we're like, okay, well then we'll pay you that. Once again, we were lucky enough to be in a position where we didn't have to say, oh, that's too bad because we can't pay you for that. But it was really helpful, when we were in an unknown sort of terrain in terms of what legitimate compensation, or legitimate, to scale compensation. But it was also just overall sort of an informative exercise. And, it's a lot to ask under, in-person circumstances that we happened to be lucky enough that we had people who are willing, or at least a few people who are willing to engage in that, because it does involve like a certain kind of self-discipline that is not everybody's way of operating in the world. And it helped inform some conversations about we had always also been in a sort of, it's not enough, so everybody should get the same kind of model, until we would sort of conk into unions or agents, mostly unions. But it really, it fed some thinking that we'd been having about that model was the more we were paying people, the more we really should consider if some people's jobs, like the directors of new plays, actually involves a much larger portion of time than other people, and to sort of try and consider that about like what's that the same amount is not always the fair amount. So that's just a little nugget there. I mean, we have generally tried to have models of like tracking, you know, of compensating people whenever they're in our midst, even if there's somebody like a director or a playwright who gets like a chunk, like, but basically, but sort of paying people to be in rooms. And that is something that we have kind of done more and more and more of as time has gone on. But yeah, that there's a certain kind of like labor that I think especially directors is like who sort of helm these whole, you know, sort of little institutions within our institutions. Not that I think any of us really have institutions because we run small theaters and that is very different. But little houses within our houses, and that they bear a larger responsibility and should be compensated, you know, appropriately for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, something that's coming up for me and listening to all of you is that certainly over the last 2 years, we've become differently and I think more highly attuned across the board to how we are spending our time. And I think I've just never really articulated this for myself, but of course, if we are more aware of that, of how we are spending our time and how much time we are spending on activities, then our feelings about, you know, what is appropriate compensation and what resources do we need to support us in making those decisions about time, those will also become, you know, newly clarified for us as well. Like we've all had this moment to consider what we need to spend time, you know, working with family, et cetera, in our lives. And I appreciate that that's giving us all the opportunity to advocate for that in some way or shift our practices in response. I want to head into some questions about the impacts, well, other impacts of these budgetary changes, both intended and not, and both successful and challenging. I want to begin with another question that's kind of inspired by things that you've all said. So, you know, Hannah started us off talking about changes that were born from growth. And later in the conversation, Maria, you talked about nimbleness. And I'm curious to hear from all of you about ways in which you may feel constrained by growth. And I'm thinking specifically about budget here, right? So like, how has your growth actually constrained your ability to allocate monies, to increase expenses, or also constrained your ability to decrease expenses in some ways, right? Because you have more compliance or staff that you need to pay, compliance needs or staff you need to pay.
I can start. So I think the first thing that pops into my mind is, you know, we've all been kind of talking about this idea of flexibility, and I do feel in some ways the flexibility when you set up these parameters and values and you're applying those values in practice, some of that flexibility in the moment gets taken away when you need to be responsive, when something needs to happen quickly. You have to take a step back and see like, okay, like this needs to happen and it needs to happen fast. How do we do this in a way that aligns with the new practices that we have put into the new, they're not really new values, but the newly stated values into place. And I think, you know, and for me personally, like we are a small, nimble theater, and we're used to being responsive and, you know, having challenges come out of the woodwork. Some are anticipated, some aren't, and it does slow down the process of decision making and and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just is an adjustment for how we approach the process. And I think it speaks to, and Kate and I have talked about this at length, like creating time, like a requirement of this new way of working means we have to plan more in advance. Like we have to build in time for there to be peaks and valleys, you know, and so that we can navigate them as they come in. And so, and sometimes it's hard to plan in advance, you know, even as much as you try and want to, especially when you're in a pandemic, you know, sometimes, and sometimes you plan in advance and you still get thrown something that you weren't expecting, and the advance time doesn't even really help that. So that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
And I would add to that sometimes, you know, planning everything in advance isn't the best. You know, it can really, you know, quash the inspiration or the opportunity of the moment. And I think sometimes like slightly random responses to, you know, to something on short notice are, you know, can be really wonderful, can yield really wonderful relationships or artistic, you know, projects, or, you know, all kinds of things. And there's something, you know, planning is your friend, especially if you're trying to control wasting money. But planning everything can also, we've actually had a lot of conversations recently about feeling like sometimes, you know, we have developed a sort of suite of programs, and more of the work we're doing is coming out of commission or those programs, and sort of missing the things that were sort of more spontaneous or random or less sort of, you know, processed somehow, and like trying to figure out how to find room for that. So that's a little bit like, yeah, growth usually ultimately must be orderly. It must be maintained in a way, and that does, you know, change things.
Yeah, I would love to hop on that too. Even before the pandemic, we were having a lot of discussions at Playco about how Playco could build in, or how theater in general could build in the ability for rapid response. I think, and also Rob, as Rob said, we've been talking for quite a while about how we can have a longer planning process so that we can gather resources. So as Maria said, we cannot be wasteful. So I think it's a balance of sort of having a plan or a chunk of resources, whether that's money, time, whatever, for the unexpected, so we can be spontaneous. I think spontaneity is so important. So it's kind of finding a new balance between this prudent long-term planning, so we have thoughtful creative process on productions and developing new work. That's really important. It's not only a fiscal consideration, but sort of having deeper, more thoughtful development processes for the creative work, and then also preserving that ability to be responsive and spontaneous. Those are both really important to the work we all do.
And yeah, Hannah, I know you had something, and then I have another question.
Yeah, I would say our major growing pain has been restructuring like our administrative processes. We started out, it was basically just me and the artistic director, Gianna Chaffee, doing all the admin work uncompensated, and doing that even just for a few years, get so much institutional memory just lives in your brain. And I went on maternity leave last year, and in preparation for that, put together like a huge spreadsheet of like just trying to download my whole brain into a Google Doc basically. And I was like, whoa, this is not a sustainable way. One person should not have this many different hats to wear. And the struggle has been the transition of like training then other ensemble members to do some of the work that we do. And a question of like, do we want like to hand out kind of small jobs across throughout our artist ensemble, or is there like one person that wants to take on this big a chunk? And that has definitely been, I think, the biggest headache for us over the last year as we've grown.
Thank you for that. And I know one of our audience participants has asked a question in the chat, and I'll just say as a heads up, Melissa, to you who asked it, this was not information that we asked our panelists to contribute ahead of time. So panelists, if you want to respond with this, you're welcome to do so. But again, it wasn't something that we had asked for in advance. So toggling back to my notes here. Yes. I'm curious to hear what were both intended and unintended successes that you achieved after these budgeting shifts. And similarly, of course, we talked a little bit about the challenges of growth, but if there are other intended or unintended challenges that you want to speak to, that would be great.
I was attempting to type at the same time. Can you repeat the first?
I was also typing. So.
Yeah, I shall repeat.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear, so my experience when I shift budgeting in any way, whether it's a new approach to something entirely or just a shift in a line, that there are the impacts that I intended for. And then there are always, however minor, unintended other impacts. And so I'm curious to hear both about successes and challenges that you encountered after the changes that you made. And would just love to know which are ones that you intended or expected, and which are ones that surprised you.
Well, I'll bring up something, and the jury is out on the end of this story, but one of my concerns, speaking to how making these changes impacts how we work and how we're producing work and things like that, is we've had this question of whether the funding community is going to understand a shift in priority. Like, let's say we end up producing less, or working in more partnerships, or whatever it is. We don't know yet whether the funding community is going to be supportive of that or have questions about it. In the before times, the output level seemed to be a pretty important standard for a lot of funders. I think the conversations are shifting in that community as well, but that's kind of a question mark for us. And then a longer term challenge for us, which again, I don't know the end of this story, is sustainability. For us, we're still coming out of the pandemic, so things aren't normal. But Rob and I, have been thinking throughout about how we build a model and a plan so that these investments are sustainable. They have to be, because people need to earn something approaching a living wage in New York, which is becoming more and more challenging for everybody. But I think sustainability is a big question, and how we make that happen.
Yeah, I just want to say, from the purview of Intermediate Art New York and talking with other members about this, and also my own experience with Art New York, I mean, the level of financial uncertainty, given a number of factors, the pandemic itself, inflation, the sudden turnoff of relief funding, the continued advocacy for more relief funding, the decades of languishing of private philanthropic giving towards theater. For all of these reasons, it is really hard to visualize concretely the next few years financially. And a lot of us have grown our budgets in the last 2 years due to decreased expenses and increased relief monies, and also are dealing, we're all dealing with a high cost of living in the place where we work and a need to respond to that as employers. And it is very challenging, and that is, I think that is a common issue, and I want to reflect that. But now I'll let other folks respond to the question.
I mean, in terms of the sort of problems of growth, I certainly right now I'm looking at what happens when all this SVOG money and all of these government money that we were lucky enough to get, and like I said, sort of like sticking that in the rainy day fund as much as possible, and but I didn't really imagine that the rainy day fund was going to be next year. But I mean, it's hard to know on the income side too about how to budget right now. It's not just how changing how we spend it, but it's like, well, assuming there will be no more, unexpected windfalls from the federal government. There are certain funders who've gotten a little bit cagey, and they're really, really, really big funders in the American theater. And it's not the time for them to go silent, but they've gone silent. On the other hand, there's been like wonderful generosity and flexible response from a number of other big funders who didn't have to do that, and individuals who didn't have to do that. And will people come and see things? Do they want to be in our small theaters sitting really tightly to each other? Based on what I've observed in the last couple of weeks, they do. But is that happenstance? And of course, the more you sort of it's flexibility is great, but it's very few of us want that to mean cycling backward, and that's also very hard to do. From not only in terms of other people's expectations, but in terms of like contracts. It's really hard to do that. And I think the other path is just doing less, and that can be painful too.
Yeah.
I think another impact that I'm experiencing is, and we've circled around this a couple of times in this panel, is just around staffing, and especially where it relates to sustainability, because it has become difficult to keep a staffing structure in place. You make these plans for like, okay, we have the next 3 years, here are the goals, here's how we want to put things into place. And we do live in New York, where the cost of living is so high, and I think we have made these investments into compensation, but we still have a long way to go, and people have different needs and different circumstances. And so finding the stability in staff structure, and in the before times, Playco had a staffing structure, and still does to some extent, a staffing structure that relied a lot on part-time work, and we're seeing that is becoming challenging for a lot of people. I'm talking specifically about like administrative staff at the moment. There are staffing structures, staffing challenges across production as well. So that's just something that I'm thinking about, and how do we take care of everyone and be able to plan in a long-term way so that we can navigate all the uncertainty of the next few years and try to keep some stability within the organization.
And Hannah, yeah.
Just one last thing to add on this, something that we've kind of always found challenging as we're a very small organization, but steadily growing is, we always want to prioritize paying our artists as much as possible and providing as much free and low cost programming to our audiences as we can. And the question is always like, when is it okay to spend money on stuff? Like, we're so averse to like putting in like a large line item for like things that we might need, even though they're like things that any theater company needs. Like, we don't have a very robust stock of equipment. And part of it is we perform in non-traditional spaces. And so a lot of those things are just like by design, we don't need a ton of stuff, but it's gotten to the point where there's been a couple years in a row where we want to earmark like, a chunk of money for more like better costume stock or like upgrade our lighting equipment. But then we always come back to, oh, but we could still be using that money to give our artists more money or to like give more free performances to our partner schools. And so it's hard to bite the bullet and buy stuff sometimes when you're so focused on the people.
So we have just 8 minutes or so left before I open this up to our audience members for some more questions. And so my final question for you is there one single takeaway that you want to share with your colleagues related to the types of changes that you implemented, the way you went about designing those changes, or of course, inspired by some of the impacts of those changes?
I would say whatever your budgeting process is, to keep it super transparent and make it a conversation with your artists and with your audience, like make it a nice like collaboration between everyone. We're huge on financial transparency. At Emmett Theater, we give our artists, like we send them our quarterly profits and loss. We give them our annual budget to get their input before we put it to the board for a vote. And it keeps that whole process very like transparent and increases the kind of tight-knit community we have, rather than having the budgeting happening just behind closed doors and a process that really only the board sees. So keeping everything out in the open has been really great for us as a company.
I agree. I think, that, I mean, if you have people who are sort of there all the time, that it's really helpful for people to understand why you're making the choices you're making and what the context for those choices is, and sometimes people will have some ideas, but mostly it's, I think it's just, it's you're informing everybody, so everybody knows what's happening. But also I want to, the sort of the petty relative of what you're talking about is, writing footnotes, financial footnotes. I really like, I'm sort of obsessed with writing financial footnotes. And which, for most places that require them means the act of doing the character count to get everything to fit into the tiny, tiny little amount of space that they give you to put them in there. But I find that like articulating in a really like constrained way, or looking at how you spend money. And it's like, well, what is there an 8%? It's just like it's sort of like a helpful artificial way of sort of making you see things that are sometimes hard to see.
I would say one thing that's been really helpful to us is spending a lot of time with our staff and with some other members of our community, really articulating Playco's values. And then we have a guide to these decisions that we've been making, because some of the decisions are really hard. It's not clear which way to go. Sometimes you end up just sort of taking a leap and saying, well, let's try this. And then if we find this doesn't work, we can always change it, but to sort of have the core values of our organization as kind of a guiding light, and have those really articulated and consensus around them has been really helpful as we do this really important, but more like nuts and bolts kind of work.
I mean, that's pretty much along the lines of what I was going to say. So I'm just echoing, and I will uplift whatever you, going back to the idea of flexibility, you know, just be prepared that the things that you do put into place are most likely going to need to morph or change in some way. But as Kate said, having a very clear framework in place to help guide those decisions so that you can talk about it with staff, community, artists, and anyone else who has, you know, a vested stake in the company. It just makes those conversations much easier to have from every direction.
Yeah, I would say that that's something that's shifted here too, that we've developed both like some essential training for staff on how to read and interact with our budget, and you know, we've opened it up quite a bit. And I will say first, just as a manager, that like the productivity increases when people understand those things better, and the quality of questions that are asked it's greater. You know, people ask informed questions that lead to, you know, more creative solutions or responses to our own needs. Yeah, I would totally align with a lot of what you all are saying. So it is time for our audience members to ask us some questions if they have them. If they don't, I have a couple more that I want to ask, don't worry. But we've got about 25 minutes left. And we would love to hear from you audience members. And I'll also note that Ash has dropped a really helpful budgeting terminology worksheet that Corrine Woods on our staff developed. That is, it's a great takeaway for this conversation. And it's a really great resource, I find, to share with staff and other colleagues, you know, who you want to open your budget up to. But that said, please, if any of you out there in TV land have questions, we'd love to hear from you. And Craig, I see a hand if you want to come on mic and ask.
Yeah, I did the raised hand thing. I'm getting the hang of the Zoom stuff. Well, the question I'm going to ask is kind of out of like what I'm not happy about. So I'm going to share one thing that I am happy about that's a result of an Art New York workshop that I took a few weeks ago about audience development that Donna Walker Kuhn led. And because of that, I emailed people at NYU and people on the city council, especially people that are on the committee for mental health, addictions and disabilities, because a lot of my plays, I'm a playwright, and a lot of my plays deal with those issues. And I have a meeting next Wednesday or next Monday morning at 9:30 just to finally talk about what we want to maybe somehow coordinate our work with someone who's the liaison for Eric Bochner, who's the city council member for actually the district that you guys are in, that kind of Midtown West district. So I'm excited about that, and that's a direct result of a workshop that I took with you guys a couple weeks ago. But the part of the question that I'm not so happy about is my theater company is a year old. Actually, our year birthday, we're going to celebrate at the Duplex this Saturday. My theater company, Engaged Playwrights Lab, is a year anniversary since it began, on April 16th of last year. So, we've been around for a year, and we're doing good stuff. And I got one grant last fall, and that money is gone. I got a NYFA grant last fall, but that's gone, and everything is coming out of my pocket. And I've been applying for other things. I haven't got some of them. I know I haven't gotten. Others I just haven't heard yet because I just haven't heard yet. It's not. I'll hear at some point. But I'm applying for more grants and fellowships and all sorts of things. I'm doing some other things that but right now everything's coming out of my pocket, and my actors have been working for. We have a play that's going to the New York Summer Fest in May, and my actors have been working without getting paid for the last few weeks. Because I've been able to, I need to pay for rehearsal space, but that's, my actors have been going without being paid because they know that I, need to do the rehearsal space, and they've just been letting themselves not get paid, and they've been all right with that. but I'm not all right with it. And so I don't have a budget. My budget is like whatever's in my pocket. My budget is my money. I don't have, and you guys are I feel like every theater is like way million miles ahead of me. And I know that there's other theaters that are exactly in the same spot that I'm in. Maybe you were when you first started out, but like I said, I'm in that spot now. And I'm trying to figure out what I can learn from what you've just told me, what I've heard the last hour or so, because it seems like you guys are talking to a place where maybe that I hope maybe I'll be in 5 or 6 years, but what do I do now? What do I do with the budget when I don't have a budget? What do I do with the budget when I have none? And I'm not concerned with.
Yes.
Can I offer a thought for you?
Yeah.
And that is that like budgeting is just sort of like an official and institutionalized approach to like having it's like having a strategy about money. So on the individual basis, and yeah, all of us did start, nobody got paid for years and years, the first few. I certainly was paid, it was one of the last people paid. It's really just, I think, and we still don't, pay very well. Every year it's a little better, but it's still not well. And I think what I would say is like, when you ask people to work with you on something, be straightforward about what your resources are. Whether that's what, like for a designer, what their budget is, what, who might be helping them, who might not be helping them, other stuff you have, whether it's money or a room that's free or some things or some relationships. Tell people what you have and tell people what you don't have, and tell people what they can expect you will deliver and what you have no idea if you'll deliver. It sounds like, you didn't have the money to pay them, so they're not expecting to be paid, but they did expect to do the thing, so you're providing the rehearsal space. But so I think it's about like the way people, the way in an interpersonal way you would want to talk to, you would want to be dealt with, which is like, this is what's going to happen. This is what I know. Be great. Maybe this can happen, but I can't guarantee it. So don't count on that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I would handle that. But I would also say, be real careful about how much of your own money you spend, because, you don't want to, all of this is like, all of the things we're talking about are also about mitigating burnout. To your point earlier, Hannah, you buy the equipment when making people make do with bad equipment makes them have to work in a much more tedious way for a lot longer and makes their lives worse, makes the quality of their work experience worse. That's like when you can afford it, but that's the thing. It's like, yes, okay, I'll reuse this platform, and it's going to take me 5 hours to make it flat. Or you could give me a little bit money more so I can have a new platform. Stuff like that. You're like, oh, right. Okay. I get it. I understand it. So, yeah, I'm going to stop blabbering.
That was, I think, really helpful. Hannah, did I see you pop? I know I saw somebody else come off mute.
Yeah, I was just we were very much in your shoes not long ago at all. Our company is only 5 years old. And something that helped us save a lot of money in the beginning was just finding partners that were really excited about our work, that were willing to donate their space as an in-kind donation. And saving money on rehearsal and performance space was a way that we were able to get surpluses very early on. So if you have a very specific mission and work that people find exciting, then see what connections you can make in your community. We rehearsed for years at the New York Foundling, which is not a theater space. We would rehearse in their office space, like cafeteria, after hours. And because they weren't looking to make money off of renting space out, they were happy to just give us that space. And that was huge for our budgets.
Yeah. And the other thing that I would say is you may not, and this is not just to Craig, this is to anyone, you may not have the resources that you wish for. You may not have the resources that you need, but you get to decide what you do with what you do have. And sometimes, this is still true for me, and I think it's true for anyone throughout their career, there are still moments where I have to go, I do not have the resources to do that. I cannot do it right now. That is often a very liberating decision. I'm not saying it's easy and it's not without disappointment, But once I make that decision, then I am free to do many other things, again, with what I have. And I want to double underscore kind of what Maria was saying about burnout. A lot of the burnout comes not only from, running into your margins and spending money that you don't exactly have. I think it also comes from beating yourself up about not being able to do exactly what you want to do when you want to do it. But if you can liberate yourself from that urgency, then I think you will find a little more peace of mind, and you will be able to make some perhaps unexpected decisions about what to do with what you do have. Rob,
I'll just take that what everyone's saying a step further, and particularly what Maria was saying, is when I think it is really good to be upfront with expectations with your artists and who you're working with. But once you've outlined those parameters and what you are able to do, also include in the conversation what those people need, in order to be a part of this. And, that's something that I've personally been trying to be more aware of, even having more resources than Craig or other people in Craig's situation have. And yes, there are times where I have to say, we can't do that, or I can't do that right now, but I can build that into next year, or I can make a plan for that, so I think it's just important to keep the conversation, a two-way street, and just try to take care of each other as best as you can. And as long as people understand what the circumstances are, I think people are pretty willing to work with you on what's available and what's possible.
Yeah, that's very much been our story for the last 2 years, is, we wanted to do all of the things that we wanted to do, and we had to say, we want to do it, but we don't have a plan for it. We want to do it, but we don't have a plan or any resources with which to do it. And then actually taking the time to build that plan, which is like a whole other panel. But yeah, I appreciate all of that. I'm going to move us along because of time. Greg, I see you've got a raised hand.
Thanks so much, Risa. I wanted to pick up on what you offered about unexpected opportunities, and ask the folks here, what is the biggest risk that you took with your budget in its recent changes? And what was the biggest surprise that came out of that for you?
I think I can answer the first half. I think the biggest risk was, we've kind of said this, but we've made, a huge, the commitments that we've made are substantial, like 10% of our operating budget approximately, which, when you say 10%, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually a lot. We've just said, we're going to do it. Like, these are the things that we have to do to take care of people and prioritize people. And so we're going to do it, and we're going to figure it out. And so that's a really big risk. I still need to think about, I don't know what I'm surprised about. Can you say, like, what do you mean by surprised? Like, things that have happened, or?
Yeah, so it's either the terminology that Risa used, an unexpected development, a sort of byproduct of a change that you've made that you weren't expecting. But it could also be something like, hey, we invested this 10% in our people, and that actually turned out much easier than we thought it would. Or that, the quality around the office changed in this way that we weren't expecting. It could be about the change itself. It could be about an unexpected development that happened as a result of the change.
I have to think about it a little more. I'll
I
pass
don't
it
know
to
that I
somebody.
have an answer to that. I feel like we're in the press, we're in the midst, we're in pre-production for 3 shows. So I don't know really where I am right now. And I can't say that, I guess Yeah, I don't know that I feel like we made changes in terms of investing in people that were different, you know, that were like a shift in sort of philosophy or a shift in vibe. So I can't, I mean, hopefully not, like hopefully, I mean, yeah, I don't have a good answer, so I'm gonna stop talking.
Other folks comments on you know, unexpected or expected surprises, challenges, successes? Otherwise, I've got another question for you.
Also, the first half of the question, if anything felt especially risky.
Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you for bringing that back up.
Well,
I mean,
we decided to go ahead with programming during Omicron. And, you know, we were sort of lucky that we had stockpiled a vast amount of rapid antigen tests and could test every single person every day, and, you know, developed a strategy. And we just looked at what was happening in South Africa, and we're like, we think we can maybe sled down this arc. And we could instead, you know, catching a few cases early while we were still in our Zoom ease into in-person. And to the extent that that's a financial consideration, it was that we had the money to in advance buy a few $1,000s worth of test kits. We were lucky.
I guess the riskiest thing that we did, I don't know how risky it really was in terms of what the stakes were, but when the pandemic hit, we were supposed to open a show March 13th, 2020. That did not happen. And by May, we kind of pivoted to doing virtual work, and we decided to just make it completely free to the public because people were having monetary constraints. And all of our public performances since then have been free, which is risky in that, like, so last year, like 85% of our income was contributed income. We had very little earned income. We do like school residencies and workshops, and that brings in a little bit, but it's been almost entirely grants and donations. And we are thinking about like how that can be sustainable. Is that like, how can we start bringing back like more paid school work? So we're in the middle of it. So I don't have much of an answer for it right now, but that's kind of the moment of transition we're in.
I'll say, you know, from my perspective of budgeting, that this is like, the risk is always personal on some level, right? Or like our appetite for risk is quite personal or subjective. So I will, you know, I'm happy to admit, like, I am the kind of person for whom a change in budgeting, whether it's 1% or 10%, because I want to uphold, that is, you know, that is significant. Always feels sort of risky, right? Like change, I've learned to work in whatever the status quo is, however satisfying or dissatisfying that status quo is. So a change is risky. And I also feel that, and I imagine many of you do too, as a manager, right? Like I want to make, I am clear, like I'm not just making good decisions esoterically for a mission or a public. I'm trying to make good decisions that have real impacts on our members, all of you, and my staff, and also my board, but I really particularly the staff who, you know, we make our livelihoods here. And that guides my appetite for risk in a way that I think serves me well, but perhaps makes me have a smaller appetite for risk than some other people.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for one more question, if anyone has one. And if not, I'm gonna send us out with something. Going once, going twice. Okay, it's me. Okay, here's my question for our panelists quickly. You talked a lot about working with your staff and a little bit about working with boards on these changes. Can you quickly tell us if you sought outside guidance or other outside support, either for the changes you discussed today or budgeting in general? I'd love to know what that outside support was or who you got it from.
We have talked to some artists as we've been trying to figure out a model. We were talking earlier about, Maria was talking earlier about time. And, you know, we spent quite a bit of our time trying to figure out what to tie our decisions about compensation to, and time made sense in a lot of ways. So we talked to, we have a BIPOC advisory council made up of artists as well as staff members and community stakeholders. So we brought some of those kinds of questions to that group, just to get artist perspectives on, you know, we can't know all the time what kind of time they make or what other considerations they have as they're trying to make their decisions on what jobs they can take and not take, and what their working conditions are. And so those were important conversations for sure.
In a much less elevated, in a more sort of petty way, you know, when we were going into producing fully, having not done so for a few years, and we were hiring all new department, new people to run stuff because, and you know, Jenny and Aaron, because people are having babies and pursuing artistic life and not wanting to be our production managers and stuff anymore. They had all this experiential knowledge of our organization as well as working on other gigs. And so we asked them to sort of suss out what had changed, and we, you know, and paid them for their time for doing that, so that we were not starting from, you know, a bunch of completely different assumptions. And that was really, really helpful and got us, you know, much closer to the, you know, reality of right now. That's you know, on a producing and programming level. I mean, but it did, if we hadn't had that information and been able to sort of, you know, start as we started bringing new people in with that information, and also talking to our peers. I mean, you know, talking to your peers is obviously always like, what are you finding out there? You know, hey guys, heads up, this is what I'm learning out here. You know, I mean, it's especially, I mean, I'm sure that this happens it happens with so much more ease when you're a small organization. There aren't that many people. It's just like we all sort of can touch the information and hold it more easily, and therefore share it more easily, and are sort of great resources for each other. I think sometimes, you know, people are scared about talking about their money with other people. It's like, it's embarrassing, or they're revealing too much or whatever, but I think it's really useful if you can, you know, when we can share information about, you know, what we're paying people or what we had better get used to paying people or whatever it might be.
Yeah, we're just always in conversation with our ensemble about not just the artistic work we're doing, but just from an operational standpoint, decisions that we're wrestling with or choices that we're making. We want their input on everything, and that helps us as we navigate these different financial questions.
Yeah, talking about money is like, you know, we hear that a lot in our lives, but I would agree with what you all are saying, that talking to the people that you're working with, talking to your colleagues about how they're managing their limited resources is a great source of good information that is going to be most responsive to the way in which you're working. Amazing. I so appreciate the opportunity to moderate this panel and how much you all have shared with us today, Kate and Rob and Hannah and Maria. It's really been a pleasure. Audience, thank you so much for taking some time to learn along with us, and to those of you who asked questions. Ash, I think that this is when I turn things back over to you, but I will just end and say a big thank you to our captioners and our interpreters today, who are helping us make sure that this content is more accessible. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Risa, and to our panelists, Kate, Rob, Maria, Hannah, our interpreters, Lisa, Stephanie, Brooke, our captioner. Thank you all so much, and to our attendee members, we appreciate the full and open and transparent conversation. I definitely learned a lot. Budgets are kind of my thing, a little obsessed. So thank you all for all of your knowledge and your experience and the takeaways. Have a great Tuesday.